Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored and presented by Harris Wood Floors, entitled Daily Living with an Engineered Hardwood Floor. My name is Sharon Schaller, Member Engagement Manager here at NWFA, and I'm going to serve as your moderator once again for this webinar. And now I would like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, and this is Billy Ward. Billy has been in the wood flooring industry for nearly 25 years. Billy began in retail sales, eventually transitioning to a project coordinator for residential and commercial installations. Approaching 13 years with Harris Wood Flooring, Billy currently serves as a technical services and claims manager. Billy, for all you 47% of the people on this call, you are inspectors through NWFA. Billy was an inspector and went through that program as well. So he's a good one to ask questions to. So without further delay, go ahead, Billy, take it over. It's all yours.
All right, thank you, Sharon. As you said, I've been in the flooring industry for almost 25 years, starting on the retail side, and have been almost 13 years now on the manufacturing side, where I've primarily been focused on technical service support for retailers, installers, consumers, along with overseeing consumer warranty claims. That means that even while I'm planted on the manufacturing side, I've still continued to have daily contact with consumers and retailers, and I receive direct feedback from them on a daily basis. So when we came up with the idea to discuss daily living with a hardwood floor, we felt that was an opportunity to address extending the life of a hardwood floor from a perspective that addresses that direct consumer feedback. A lot of this information might seem obvious or redundant to those of us who tend to live inside the bubble of hardwood flooring, but unfortunately that isn't the case a lot of times for the people who end up being the end user of our products. As a claims manager, I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of consumer concerns or perceived claims, potential claims that get reported to us normally aren't typically in any way related to an actual manufacturing issue. Most of the concerns that get reported to us really are simply the result of a consumer's lack of understanding of what they've purchased and how it actually performs. Retailers and sales advisors can save their consumers and themselves a ton of grief just by setting realistic expectations for hardwood flooring up front, and then providing proper guidance on caring for the floor after the sale is completed. Now, what I find is initially in the buying process or in the selection process, most consumers always ask about cleaning their floor. They want to know if a floor can be refinished. Those are the common things that first comes to mind for them. But realistically, if we can just provide simple overall floor protection, that's going to be the key to a long floor life. And with that in mind, the first thing I wanted to touch on is the effect of sunlight and UV light on hardwood. And I wanted to start there because that's a factor that can have an immediate influence on the long-term appearance of a floor, but it's something that consumers don't often think about until years down the road, if they ever think about it at all. We know that UV rays, whether or not it's from sun or artificial light, is going to accelerate the oxidation and aging of hardwood. Obviously, that's going to lead to color change in the wood. It can lead to color change or fading in the stain or changes in the finish. At Harris, we deal exclusively in domestic species. And those, generally speaking, tend to be less photosensitive than some of your exotics. But even in the domestic species, you're going to have some that are more photosensitive, something like American cherry or walnut. Those can change drastically over time. American cherry is going to darken and tends to do so fairly rapidly, where walnut will lighten over time. The key for the best long-term appearance is to either ensure that floor is patina or is going to patina as evenly as it can as it undergoes those changes, or you want to try and reduce the amount of UV light exposure altogether. Reducing UV light, the best way to do that obviously is going to be to use window coverings or UV protected films. That's not always going to be practical. Depending on the decor, people obviously want those windows for the natural light. They don't want their rooms to be shaded maybe, or the decor just doesn't welcome drapes or blinds. A lot of people are weary of UV protected films. They don't want to use those because they've heard that it's going to affect their plants, and that's not really a widespread issue. You do have some plants that may have a tough time adjusting when certain rays are removed, but ultimately not everybody's going to want to do what's needed to really reduce the light. So in that case, the key is going to be to make sure that that floor does patina evenly, and you're going to want to do that and recommend that they rearrange rugs and runners periodically. They'll want to rearrange low-lying furniture or freestanding fixtures so that you can expose as much of the floor as possible to similar lighting. If you look at that photo in the current slide, that's one of our walnut floors. That was an instance, kind of a typical case where a customer put a rug in place and put it out of mind. They don't think about it again. And I've encountered multiple instances, over the years where, consumers a lot of times never realize the type of color change their floors experienced until they start moving things out of a house that they put on the market. Then they see that jigsaw puzzle of light and dark wood throughout their rooms, and then they're scrambling to figure out what they can do to correct it. In the case of especially photosensitive species like cherry, and that do change, pretty quickly. I've encountered more and more installers and retailers that make the suggestion, and I've started making it myself, that homeowners may want to consider waiting a few weeks to several weeks after the initial installation of their floor before they actually place area rugs, especially full-size or room-size rugs, and that way they can allow that initial, change or initial patining of the floor to kind of begin, and that way it'll mitigate the long-term visual effects. Another factor that's going to have an immediate impact on floors from the moment they're installed are the environmental conditions. I'll still routinely get inquiries from customers. They want to use a floor in their 3-season room or sunroom that may be enclosed, but there's no HVAC or there's no heat during the winter months. People want to use them in seasonal homes, seasonal cabins, where they don't have, or they'll admittedly say that they're not going to maintain the environment in the seasons when it's not in use. I'll even have customers that call and they're inquiring about wanting to use a floor on a covered porch or a screened-in porch. And they'll say, well, it's not closed in, but it's covered. It doesn't get any weather or it doesn't get rained on. And the bottom line is the floors should only be installed in enclosed structures that are environmentally controlled year-round. The National Wood Flooring Association, as you see on your screen, is going to recommend a temperature range of 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The NWFA recommends a relative humidity of 30 to 50%. We recommend a relative humidity of 35 to 55%. Some manufacturers' recommendations are going to vary. So you always want to yield to the manufacturer's recommendations if they are different than the NWFA's. That being said, slight variations outside of those environmental ranges aren't necessarily going to be avoidable, and they're not necessarily going to be problematic. The big thing is that you want to, tell homeowners they need to limit the seasonal changes and avoid large swings in those environmental conditions from season to season. I always encourage homeowners to use additional humidity controls, and I definitely recommend that they employ hygrometers in the areas of the home where they do have hardwood, so that can tip them off to drastic changes in relative humidity. Many consumers have no idea how widely the conditions in their home vary because they only consider the temperature that they keep their HVAC system set at, or they're not actively monitoring their humidification. Numerous times over the years, I've encountered homeowners that, whether or not it was, a claim with an inspector or just their own report, where they've had issues like splits or checks that have formed sometimes several years after the floor is initially installed. It may be abnormal gapping, dry cupping, etc. And when you try to explain to them that their issues are environmentally related, they'll insist that it can't be due to the environment because, they're running their HVAC, and they'll say, well, I have a whole house humidifier, or I have humidifiers I run during the winter. And the issues with, some of the whole house humidifiers and the portable humidifiers is that a lot of the older systems and the inexpensive portable units, they have general settings that introduce moisture based on just the volume of the system or the airflow, and they don't have any actual real-time readings or feedback from the home's environment. So often, when the homeowner, or in the case of an inspector that's on the job, checks the relative humidity in the home with a hygrometer, they find that the actual levels are far different than what the system says it should be. And you do want to pay particular attention to humidity in homes with radiant heat, which are continuing obviously to become more and more a larger segment of the industry. Now, factors like UV light, environmental conditions, those aren't things that consumers will necessarily bring up on their own or focus on because they're more intangible. They don't see them, they don't feel them. But they all always, if you've ever talked to a consumer selecting a floor, they all ask about dents and scratches. And as we know, all wood floors are going to scratch and dent. Damage isn't going to be completely avoidable, but they can all do some simple things to reduce the amount of damage that they do encounter. First off, walk-off mats inside and outside of entryways. You want to limit the amount of dirt and grit and other loose particulate that gets tracked in onto the floor. Again, when they're after an installation, placing stuff back into place, make sure that they're using soft felt type protectors on the bottoms of all their chair legs, furniture and fixture legs. If they have chairs with casters, such as office chairs, which is definitely becoming more and more common with more people working from home these days. They want to avoid metal or hard plastic casters whenever possible. They really should be changing those out to a wide rubber barrel style caster that's designed for hardwood. If they can't do that, they should definitely be using some sort of protective mats or rugs under those chairs. Ideally, they should use a rug that's woven from natural fibers and is going to be breathable. You want to avoid full plastic, your traditional hard surface floor protectors you see in commercial settings on carpet. You don't want that plastic to trap moisture underneath. I've seen any number of floors over the years with floor protectors that have big areas of black wood underneath of them where they've been trapping moisture. If they do need something other than a rug that's going to allow the floor to roll smoothly, if that's important to them, more and more they can find options like hard mats that are made out of hardwood or bamboo that may be in some sort of a woven construction or in a parquet type formulation that will give them that hard surface that they're looking for. Again, when they're moving in after an installation or into a new home with new flooring, you want to encourage them also not to slide or roll heavy objects. Whenever possible, they really need to be lifted and placed into position. If they can't be lifted, they should be using plywood or another hard sheeting to roll or slide those on. Obviously, encourage them to put some sort of a soft cloth or sheet between the sheeting and the floor surface itself to resist scratches. One thing I've had I don't know how many calls I've had over the years, but I've had them a lot, where you get a frantic call from a customer, or in some cases an installer that's looking for advice on how to repair or replace the boards in their new kitchen floor because they've got those little telltale wheel marks going through the center of their new floor where the installer or the appliance delivery man wheeled the refrigerator right across the floor when they were putting it back into position. So protecting that surface with a hard sheet is key in those instances. While we're speaking of dents and scratches, another common call that we get is about pets and hardwood, and again, with more people working from home these days, people are looking for companionship, so we're only seeing an increased number of homes with pets. At least once or twice a week, I get a phone call or an email inquiry or an inquiry from a website with somebody just, they just shoot out the general question, how does this floor hold up to pets? And it's a bit of a loaded question. It's a good question. But, how big is the pet? How well are they maintaining the pet's nails? What kind of floor are they looking at specifically? Those are all things that you need to consider. All wood floors are going to be susceptible to some degree of damage from pet nails. But at least in my experience anyway, consumers aren't completely naive to that aspect of it. And they do anticipate needing to take precautions with pets. One thing I have noticed though is that when they're debating selecting a floor for a home with pets, a lot of consumers tend to focus almost primarily on hardness, and they'll look at Janka ratings on floors, and that gets into a whole other aspect when you're discussing Janka rating and engineered floors and how much those can actually translate or be used, depending on the thickness of the veneer, the core construction of a product. So that's not always a good tool for the customer to rely on solely. In a lot of instances, the actual visual characteristics of the wood species or the floor surface itself are going to be as important, if not more important, than that hardness rating. I would say that with consumer calls, complaints, concerns with pets and nails, the hardness is the one that comes into play most. People a lot of times will look at and they'll say, well, you've got cherry, you offer walnut, you offer birch, you offer oak, you offer hickory, you offer maple. And out of all those, maple's the hardest on this scale that I'm looking at, so I'm going to go with maple. And if they've got a smooth maple floor, while maple may be harder and not dent as deeply or severely, there's not a lot of graining, there's not a lot of movement in that floor to distract your eyes. So a shallow, dent, that little squiggly line that you get from that pet nail tends to show up pretty readily in a hard floor like maple. Whereas if they had selected a softer wood, but a wood that had a distressed, finishing process, or a scraped surface, maybe wire brushing, or if they went with even a smooth floor, but in a heavier grain species like an oak, those tend to do, even though they may dent a little more severely than the harder species, tend to do a better job, in my experience, in hiding or camouflaging the wear and tear that you're going to see in all floors from those pet nails. So, they definitely need to consider those visual characteristics and not just rely on a hardness rating. The other things not related to dents or scratches is, as you see there, they need to pay particular attention to pet accidents. Hopefully their pet's housebroken and they don't have repeated accidents. When they do have them, though, they need to be cleaned up promptly. They also want to protect those areas where they're feeding and drinking, and use some protective rugs or mats to catch any spills or grit that get knocked onto the floor. Excuse me. And now that we've discussed the things that they can kind of do from the start to provide just general protection to the floor surface, we can start to look at long-term maintenance. First and foremost, regular sweeping or vacuuming is going to be the aspect of maintenance that I want to stress to a consumer the most. We recommend walk-off mats at entryways so that they limit the amount of dirt and dust and grit that gets tracked onto a floor, because that's what gets ground into the finish and is the primary cause of the micro cuts and scratches that result in gloss reduction and wear patterns in the clear coat. So while we're trying to catch what we can, we want to also make sure to remove as often as possible whatever we don't prevent from being tracked in. Using a soft bristle brush or some sort of a soft cloth product like a microfiber mop or a dry Swiffer mop would be ideal. If they are going to use a vacuum instead of sweeping or using a Swiffer type pad, they want to be able to turn off or raise the beater bar if it's equipped with a beater bar, or ideally, they want to use a hard floor attachment with soft bristles and stay away from the beater bar altogether. Also, if they are using a vacuum, make sure and remind them to check the wheels, make sure they're free of dirt and debris, that they're in good repair, that there's not any sharp chips or cuts that may actually cause scratching on the surface of the floor. Ultimately, though, tell customers to sweep or vacuum as often as they can, and really using a cleaner itself is something they really just need to do is all absolutely necessary. It might be once a month, maybe twice a month, with occasional cleanings in the main traffic areas, but the vacuuming is the thing to do most often. Now, when we're discussing the use of cleaners, as you see there on the screen, the thing you want to remind them of is water and wood don't mix. There's plenty of sources of moisture that can get into the floor and into the home, whether or not it's the environment, leaks, spills, casual water that's tracked in on shoes. All those are sources of moisture, but if it's not the largest, it's one of the largest sources, and that's going to be improper maintenance. And they want to avoid that water and that excess water because that can cause finish issues like clouding or softening of the urethane. It can also stress the wood fiber itself, particularly at the joints where the wood's going to more readily draw it in, and that can cause peak joints, checks, splits, splinters. So again, they want to make sure that they don't let liquid stand on the floor. Two, we say there on the screen, never damp or wet mop your floor. And what I am referring to there is really to try to encourage them to avoid actual mopping from a bucket, using cleaners that have to be mixed with water, while if they're mixed properly may not cause issues. Human nature tells us that someone will say, well, I don't, I use a mop in a bucket, but I wring out my mop really well, or I use a cloth and I wring it out and it's barely damp. But what you really find is people say, well, if a little bit's good, a lot's better. So if someone's telling you they're barely wiping their floor, they're usually getting it a lot wetter than either they want to admit or than they realize. Another thing is you're always going to have some new infomercial out there that's talking about the latest steam cleaner or multi-surface floor scrubber that's putting down water and picking the water back up. Bottom line, no scrubbers, no clean or steamers. I always hear customers will call and they'll say, well, your floor care sheet says not to use water, but my steam cleaner doesn't actually leave water on the floor, or doesn't wet the floor when I'm done. The floor is dry, and that's the problem, is that a lot of consumers hear moisture and they only equate that to actual visible or standing water. They don't consider the effects that just moisture vapor can have on a floor. So when you're heating that water into steam and shooting that into the joints, they don't consider the type of effect that can have long term on the wood itself. The best method for caring for hardwood is just going to be able to avoid water, at all whenever possible. Make use of a pre-mixed no wax hardwood floor cleaner and a cut loop terry cloth or microfiber type hardwood mop. Something that can be sprayed on, so you're not over wetting the floor and then removed with the dry mop. You definitely want to remind customers to either launder those mop heads in between cleanings or swap them out in between cleanings so they can avoid redepositing dirt and residue onto the surface that they may have picked up from a previous cleaning. And they want to have a mop that's dedicated solely to the hardwood areas of the home. That's particularly important for people that have cleaning services. They'll want to stress to that cleaning service that even though they're using a hardwood cleaner here, a lot of times they may be using some other hard surface cleaner on the ceramic in the kitchen or on the luxury vinyl plank in the bathroom. But if they're not changing out that mop head, you run into cross contamination that may cause buildup, streaks, and then they're trying to figure out where the buildup's coming from and they don't know how to get it off. So as you see there, obviously with pre-finished floors, you want to use any sort of waxes, oil soaps, stay away from the Murphys and anything that's going to create an artificial shine. You don't want to use any oils. Stay away from the ammonias. Vinegar, that's one we've all heard of. You want to avoid those home remedies you used to hear. Use a mixture of, take your bucket of water and pour in a cup of vinegar and use that. That's something we don't recommend these days anymore. Again, we want to discourage them from using the wet mopping, but they also, should stay away from the vinegar. Now, besides maintaining, and after a customer, they protected the floor, they've been maintaining the floor for years, they all eventually want to know about refinishing. It wasn't that long ago that factory finished floors only had 5-year, 10-year, or 15-year warranties, maybe a good, better, best. I remember those. Nowadays, most manufacturers, or majority, like Harris, we do offer lifetime finishes these days, and you can do that because of the improvements and the advancements we've made with the additives, that we're adding to the urethane finishes, and with that technology we're using today. Realistically speaking, a properly maintained factory finish floor, should not wear through. Will they scratch? Yes. Are they going to dull? Are you going to see gloss reduction? You'll definitely will eventually. But as long as the finish, doesn't wear through like it's warranted not to, a customer really shouldn't have to concern themselves normally with actually sanding and refinishing a floor. And not that they can't be refinished, they can, but that's, as you see, I mean, that's your more aggressive approach. It's really something for most people where refinishing should only have to be done if they're trying to repair damage to exposed wood fiber, for a floor that may have already actually worn through the finish or lost finish, or if they're wanting to, just change the color of the floor. They're wanting to remove what they have, apply a new stain color. Most, when we get calls from most customers that are inquiring about refinishing, they're normally not looking for actual refinishing. They're normally just looking to restore the gloss and the clarity of that original finish coat. As long as that factory finish is, again, remains intact like it's warranted to do, it can be screened and recoded, without sanding away any of the added durability that you're getting from the factory finish. One thing that you want to keep in mind, though, when you do speak to consumers about that is, and again, as most of us in the industry are aware, when you get into UV cured finishes that have additives like aluminum oxide or ceramic particles, they're notoriously difficult to abrade, which that's the intent. They're formulated and designed to resist abrasive wear and wear through. So they're going to be difficult to abrade. They can be difficult to get proper adhesion with a new coat of urethane. So, I always tell a customer that, that's not something we're going to recommend that they do as a DIY project. They always want to reach out and look for somebody that is an experienced refinisher and only have that done by a professional. So with that, that's pretty much everything we have scripted as far as daily living with a hardwood floor. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Sharon and open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Billy. Great presentation. A lot of good information for these people here on the webinar today. The first question comes from Scott, and he says, how does the core play a role in the balance of the plank? Why are there so many different core materials?
That may be a little more to get into with a quick answer. I mean, we only do all wood cross ply construction. So I mean, as far as Harris goes, we're trying to use stable species and a stable construction so that you get equal expansion and contraction. We don't currently do anything with a MDF or other type of composite core. So what we're shooting for is to have something that is environmentally stable, and like I said, also doing that cross ply construction so that each ply is going to kind of work against each other and stabilize each other.
Okay, we have a question from Patrick, and I think this is just, I think you covered it, but you might want to just give us your thoughts on this. On cleaning a floor with a cleaner, do you or your company have a guideline on how often to use a product? I had a manufacturer tell me that a customer can clean it every day if they wanted to. We know all of these cleaners have water in them. I look at a floor once that they clean it every day, which cause the finish to lift at the end joints. Long question, but.
Yeah, like you said, I kind of touched on that. I don't have a specific set in stone recommendation. Like I said, I encourage them just to really only use the cleaner as is absolutely necessary. Like I said, for most people, it's probably, realistically speaking, once a month, maybe a couple times a month if they've got heavier traffic. So I'll tell people, really to use their cleaner every few weeks and then just spot clean as needed. If they need to pull out their bottle of Bona or whatever brand they're using, and clean some footprints or something from oil that's been, tracked from their socks or something like that in their hallway or at the front door, they can do that. But overall cleaning, probably a couple times a month would be my recommendation at most.
Okay, next question. What are your thoughts on using refresher type products in lieu of recoding and refinishing?
I typically don't recommend them. I personally, I discourage them from it as far as a long-term resolution. Years ago, we used to have our own refresher product when we had our own private label product, and based on the feedback we used to get, the thing that I noticed was you get a lot of inconsistent results. A lot of the refreshers, one, you've got to make sure that there's no other contaminants from previous cleaners, waxes, oils. If the customer isn't stripping that existing finish and getting everything off of it, you can run into adhesion issues with a lot of the refresher or rejuvenator type products. If they don't apply them at the proper rate, if they're applying it too heavily or too thinly, that can result in streaking, or they may end up with cloudiness. So, in my experience, there's just a lot of room for error. In the short term, if it's somebody that's looking for an inexpensive, quick fix, maybe for a home they're putting on the market, they just want, they don't want to put a big investment in it and they're wanting to make the floor shiny. That may be acceptable. But if it's somebody that's going to be in a home and they're telling me they're planning on being in the home and they're looking to restore the floor, I'm always going to encourage them to have it done professionally and have it actually recoated instead of mopping on something out of a bottle.
Okay. Josh has a question. Will wire brush floors wear faster due to dirt and grit getting trapped in the soft grain?
I don't know that they won't necessarily wear faster. There is a concern there as far as maintenance, where, again, specifying and pushing home the point that they need to do vacuuming regularly. The one thing they don't want to do, especially with things like wire brush floors, is go over the floor with a wet cleaner until they vacuumed. You are going to get dirt and debris probably in those soft grain areas, so you want to try to remove as much of that as possible. So you may see homes where they do get soil buildup, but a lot of times, like I said, that's just more of a maintenance concern than a finish concern. Anytime they've got any sort of distressing but particularly with wire brushing or something that is creating those deeper contours, doing a thorough vacuuming or sweeping before they use a wet cleaner is really the key to avoid that buildup in those low areas.
Okay, Brian has more of a comment. Maybe you can put your input on this one. I understand the reality of the environmental conditions necessary for good wood floor performance, but my experience indicates most consumers are likely to not understand or have and adhere to these conditions in their homes. It's a lot to expect from them.
Yeah, well, it can be. I think the point, I guess, more so that we really want to make. I mean, regardless of whether or not it's a lot to ask of them. I mean, the science of wood is going to be what the science of wood is, and we know that wood is going to react poorly in extreme conditions. So even though it's a lot to ask of them, the key is to at least make them aware of it. I think that's the point I really wanted to stress, is that a lot of the calls that we get and a lot of the topics we covered are things that customers just, they'll say that they didn't know, they weren't aware. And we can put it on installation instructions, we can put it on a product warranty, we can put it on a care sheet on the website, but a lot of times it's just a matter of, in the early process and talking to customers, setting those expectations and making them aware of it. So at least they're making their most informed decision. So, they can decide themselves. It may be too much that they feel they can handle, and they may go a different route, but at least make them aware of it.
Thank you for that. Sadie has a question. What is your recommendation for removing adhesives or other residues like shoe scuffs?
For those, anything that can't be removed with their, just their no wax cleaner, if it is like adhesive from installation or rubber residue from a tennis shoe or a hard-heeled shoe, I always just recommend 100% mineral spirits, and always stress 100% mineral spirits. The mineral spirits won't, they don't negatively impact our UV cured urethane finishes. They're not caustic enough to strip or compromise the finish, but they're strong enough to remove, most residues that have it permanently bonded to the floor. They're not going to be effective, say, with a urethane adhesive that was left on or not completely wiped off and it's been curing for 5 days. It's probably not going to cut that. But for fresh adhesive or other types of residue that get tracked on, the mineral spirits will generally remove it. And again, I always just say 100% mineral spirits. I want to look for that. Not all mineral spirits or even some paint thinners may necessarily contain anything else that might be harmful, but they don't always list it, so you don't know. So if you go with 100% mineral spirits, you're going to be safe, and there's no additives there that are going to settle on the floor. The mineral spirit itself will evaporate, quickly as it's being used and doesn't leave anything behind. So by getting just 100% mineral spirits, you at least know that there's no other additives that might be left to contaminate the surface of the floor.
Okay, and Gary asked the question, will conditioners affect recoding with poly?
They may. And again, that's something that I may not be the best in this instance to ask on that, just because I don't deal a lot with factory, or I'm sorry, with field finishing. I probably know just enough to be dangerous, because we do deal in primarily factory finished floors. But yeah, generally speaking, I mean, any conditioner type of products and that sort of thing, if they're not removed prior to screening and refinishing, could cause adhesion issues. So that's something that probably would be better directed to someone that is doing refinishing as their primary business, and has a little more experiences, what's required to remove them and ensure that it doesn't affect the adhesion.
Ricky wants to know, is denatured alcohol okay to use?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's not something you're going to use in wide areas, denatured alcohol or even mineral spirits for that matter. You know, odor-wise and everything else, it's not something normally that somebody's going to be using widely and often. So denatured alcohol itself typically isn't problematic, but again, mineral spirits is just the thing that we use most often, we know is safe, and that's typically what I recommend. But if you just need to use it for spot cleaning and want to test an inconspicuous area, always, especially depending on the manufacturer, the type of finish, etc. Always test an inconspicuous area before you use it, or even mineral spirits.
Okay, Brian's question is, in my inspections, I see more issues in floors that have been wire brushed, smoked, and other customs treatments. Do these processes affect the integrity of the wood itself?
I'm not so sure on smoking a floor, what type of effect that would have really on the integrity of the fiber. I mean, anytime you're doing, if you're distressing wood, I mean, just by definition, distressing is, affecting, that wood, I don't want to say negatively, but still, it's just what it says, distressing the wood. So whether or not it's scraping or wire brushing or what have you, that can always maybe loosen a little bit of fiber. You may have areas that create some opening in the surface. So I would tell any customer that has a distressed floor that they should expect that they may occasionally see areas where they may have to go back in and do some touch up, with a stain pen or a filler stick or a putty, and that's important to note in any wood floor. That the use of touch up products by itself isn't a warranty issue. It doesn't indicate that there's any real the floor has been compromised in any way. I mean, just wood by its nature is going to undergo occasional damage, and you're going to have to do some touch up. So I mean, that's something that you'd want to stress, especially on any floor that has any sort of distressing, whether it's scraping or wire brushing, that the periodic touch up should be considered normal. A lot of manufacturers' warranties are going to warrant wear through the finish, and in most instances, you're going to see something along the lines of a percentage of the floor, like we say, we would consider, finish wear through to be full loss of finish over more than 3% of the floor surface. So those little minor areas that you may have, a board has a piece of grain that gets pulled, or a board gets chipped and exposed on the edge, those little areas are going to be within that expected, realistic wear rate for a floor, and you'd want to encourage them and explain to them that touching up those areas are going to be part of having a hardwood.
Well, thank you. One more question here. Beside the topics you already touched on, are there any other concerns you hear repeated by consumers that aren't actual claims or are issues that could be avoided if addressed early on?
Probably the one that comes up, like I said, it's not maintenance related, but that does come up would be concerns or complaints over color variation, or the natural character in the wood. Customers a lot of times, they get one small take-home sample. They're looking at a 3 by 5 inch piece, and you can put the disclaimers and any number of things in writing in however many places you can on the sample board, again on the installation instructions, etc. But they see that one little piece, or they see the sample board with a couple planks, and they focus on the part of it that they really like, without understanding that they're getting real wood and that they're going to have the underlying color variation for whatever species they're dealing with, and that may include things like knots or minor wormholes or mineral streaks. So that would be the one I see most often, and really, short of making sure consumers are aware when they're buying it, and trying to stress, hey, you're looking at a small color sample. Here's what you need to understand about the floor. Here is how the floor is described by the manufacturer. The other thing is going to be making sure that they're inspecting and accepting the floor, when they receive it. Unfortunately, I see a lot of jobs, the installer gets 2,000 foot in, the customer never looked at the floor. Whether or not it's a new construction or a remodel, for some reason, customers can have the wood delivered to their home. It can sit there for a week. They leave the house, the installer can do the installation, they come home afterwards. Well, that's not what I thought it was going to be. So, stressing that, they need to be inspecting the floor. One, installers should be inspecting during installation, to call out any potential issues, identify any quality concerns or manufacturing concerns. But the customers, need to be looking at that product and giving the thumbs up, and confirming that, yes, this is what I selected, this is what I thought I was getting, before they continue on with the installation.
Thank you, Billy. Great information. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. That wraps up our Q&A questions. Billy, would you mind advancing that slide once more? Because if you do, anyone on this hearing this recording or on this live webinar have any further questions about engineered floor, you can always contact Billy here on this contact screen information. There's his email. There's Sadie Evans. She's got an email right there. So on behalf of NWFA and Harris Wood Floors, I want to thank you for joining us today. I want you to stay healthy and have a great rest of your day.